There has been so much talk lately about saving the West, saving Western civilization. And I think for many, what that has meant is just, spend more time on Twitter complaining, you know. And I was just wondering whether you have felt that these conversations about saving the West are starting to feel a little bit tedious.
When you're facing darkness, if you're facing a dragon, if you're facing a gargoyle, if you're facing a monster of some kind, work with its reflection on a shield. Stop looking directly at it, because you will become hollowed out by it. I would ask you to think symbolically and metaphorically about the conditions of your own life. You never defeat demons by talking about them constantly. You focus on the opposite. I suspect in the end we will get cultural fatigue of that kind of commentary. And I think there's a difference between being timely and timeless. Because I have a theory that when we die and suddenly there's Peter and he's got the keys to heaven, he'll say, "I can't let you in, you smell of the internet." We're being sold Pentecost, but we really have Babel. As we build our own tower as a monument to our own magnificence, we become Babeled. And despite the technology that we have in our own hands, in actual fact, we are more lonely, we are more deprived, we have built more barriers and more blocks to our neighbours than ever before. But as humans, we simply need what I sometimes call pinpricks of eternity, because if we don't, life becomes, as I said, growingly more thinned out, and we lose our way. To experience beauty is an intimation of eternity. That's a big thought. It's a glimpse of something, and these are the breadcrumbs that get us through the darkest of forests. Said Dad, he said, atheism is for old people. Christ is a great crow. Christ is a crow that has come down to suck the sorrow out of the world in the most spectacular act of love. It's like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. Can you imagine? Because orthodoxy is a very physical tradition where, there's the kissing of icons, the lighting of candles, there's the prostrations, there's the fasting. It's absolutely intoxicating. And the predominant sensation you have when you walk into divine liturgy is, I'm desperate for this. I'm so hungry for this.
All right, well, Dr. Martin Shaw, it's an absolute honor to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You are a writer, a mythologist, a storyteller, and you are also someone that has spent a fair bit of time in the wild. You are also the host of the Jawbone podcast, which I've just become your number one fan. I can't get enough of it. I put it on replay on road trips here in Australia, on the way to drop the kids off at school, and I just can't tell. I think anyone who discovers your work is just going to be thrilled. And I think it's quite rare in our time to have. I hate to call it content, but that's what people call it. Content like yours. It feels very rare, and I'm just so grateful for it. So just first of all, massive thank you, and just a massive shout out to everyone who's into what I do to go and check out what you do.
Okay.
Now, one of the reasons I was so eager to speak with you is because, I think your voice as a storyteller has something really vital to offer the public conversation at the moment. I think we are drowning in information. I think we're drowning in this false promise that social media was going to connect us all. And I think we're all going a little bit insane. And I think really we need the clarity that comes from storytelling so that we may better, you know, take on the psychosis of modern living, which I think we're all being crushed under the weight of. So if you didn't mind, I wanted to reel off some quick facts about what's going on in the West at the moment. And then I'll see if you might be able to help us diagnose it or help us make sense of it. Okay. So in one study, it found that 80% of people surveyed across age groups in the UK felt that their lives were meaningless, that they lacked purpose. The UK is now ranked the second most miserable place in the world to live in. Antidepressant prescriptions have doubled over the last couple of decades. In America, 61% of Gen Z say they feel lonely, and 43% say they feel unloved. In the last 2 decades in America, suicide rates have unfortunately increased almost 40%. The UK birth rate is now 1.49 children per woman, which is the lowest since records began. Weekly church attendance in the UK has also collapsed by about 90% over the last century. Meanwhile, anti-Christian attacks in Europe have skyrocketed. In a single year, it jumped 44%. In France, in just a single year, there were over 1,000 churches that were vandalized, that were attacked, that were burnt down, and a similar story is playing out in the UK, Germany, Canada, and beyond. Overall, it seems that there's this growing sense of emptiness amongst Westerners, especially young people, of hopelessness, of spiritual dislocation, and many feel lost, not sure who they are, what they should be doing, or where they should even begin looking for that. You know, and so I guess the question for you is, is this what progress is meant to look like? Is this the way we've all, we were supposed to live? Is this the utopia that the postmodernists promised us? And are we witnessing this unraveling of a people who have lost their way?
Well, what you're describing is the beginning of any really great myth. Uh, it seems to be that culturally we are in a protracted attempt to commit suicide, or at the very least blind ourselves. And the mystics and the thinkers and the artists that we love are not people that just see statistically their own lives, they behold them. They
Mm,
behold them with what James Hillman used to call the poetic basis of mind. So there is what the Mexicans call a sense of the river beneath the river. And for sure, these are desperate times, and most of us feel outnumbered and outgunned. But the poets will tell you that is the exact moment when the miraculous can enter.
mm,
And one of the reasons I find myself having to, um, I'm careful. I'm careful with the amount of cultural information I receive at the moment. I curate my imagination quite carefully because if you're continually staring into the face of a monster, you risk burnout very quickly. There's no
mm.
artfulness to that. Something I've said a million times before is that in myths and stories, when you're facing darkness, if you're facing a dragon, if you're facing a gargoyle, if you're facing a monster of some kind, work with its reflection on a shield. Stop looking
Oh,
directly at it because you will become hollowed out by it. And as somebody that has spent 30 years now working with thousands of modern people and how they relate to ancient myths, I know that burnout is a significant issue and despair is a significant issue with many of the folks that turn up to work with me. They are looking for a different way of being in the world. They long for a deeper life. But at the same time, ironically, and this is very strange for a storyteller to say this, I would I would venture the idea that we are now surrounded by too many stories.
mm,
Too many stories. And a lot of those stories are rather poisonous, they are insidious, they are designed to entrance us, not to wake us up.
mm,
And the kind of myths and stories that I lean back into, and has been my practice now for a very long time, are ones that have something redemptive in them, something challenging in them, something that ironically are not really to do with a long time ago. They're actually to do with a kind of primordial present, a kind of living myth. And once you're around that, you can reevaluate the detritus of our times in a different way. You're not going to be inert, you are going to be stirred into action. But to be stirred into action is not just a it's not just an involvement of the will, it's an involvement of the heart. Your heart has to swoon. Your heart has to
mm,
swoon. And so the business of stories is to pull us into a deeper truth that statistics cannot find. They will flag up a malaise or depression or all the things you've just mentioned, but through the medium of images, not just, and in a recent report, we just heard da 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 da. That's
mm,
not actually, if we're going to use a big word, if that's really not what the soul is stirred by in us. The soul, we know this from almost all cultures, is stirred by image, is stirred by ritual, is stirred by story, is stirred by music, and actually endless talking heads just gnawing away at some perpetual sense of anxiety, which we all have already. There comes a point where you need to orientate that, as I said, towards a sense of beholding, not just seeing life. You need to orientate it towards a sense of beauty, because as a Christian, uh, to experience beauty is an intimation of eternity. That's a big
Mm.
thought. It's a
Yeah.
glimpse of something, and these are the breadcrumbs that get us through the darkest of forests.
I want to unpack this idea of glancing at evil through the reflection in the shield, conjuring up this notion of Medusa, and I believe it was Medusa, and
Hmm.
going through the maze and not being turned to stone in a sense. I was wondering how someone might even go about doing that in the modern world. Does it require literally turning off the phone, throwing it away? How does one go about looking at this through the reflection?
The reflection is your artfulness. And actually, for a lot of people, there's a lot of work they need to do. I was saying recently that when people turn up to study with me, coming out of the profound kind of imaginative rinsing that modernity does to them, they often turn up and say, "I need to be heard. I
Mm,
want myths to back up whatever it is I need to say." And then if they've worked with me thoroughly and they've really connected to what I'm doing, they come out the other end and it's a much deeper question. How do I speak? How do I speak?
mm,
Do I speak in a way that corn grows on my tongue? Do I speak in a way that nourishes and raises up other people? But also, do I speak in a way that can, when needed, address truth to power? You know,
mm,
it's not just about being florid and eloquent. I always say myth is a wild way of telling the truth. And you have to look at the conditions of your own life and your own culture, and you have to do what the old bards, the shanakis, the griots, and the skalds, these are all words for storyteller, traditionally do, which is they say profound things, but um, they use poetic form and meter to do it, because actually that in some way protects you. So here's a very old idea. In Celtic myth, if you grow slowly into a human being, which is there's no guarantee you will, you may grow as a facsimile if you're not fed right, you're not nurtured right. But if you are nurtured with stories, if you're nurtured to a relationship with what I would call God's original church, which is nature, the thing he said was very good. um, it's like being wrapped in a swan feather cloak, and there's a robustness to you, and there's a quiet confidence to you, and there's a humility to you. But if you don't, if you are deprived of story, if you're deprived of relationship to what I would call wild nature, then the chances are you've followed the wrong God's home by the time
mm,
you've reached 30. And you are going to be prone to enormous bursts of anxiety, a sense of meaninglessness, because we're living in a culture that is very good at immediately satisfying desire, because what it wants to do is to lead us away from longing. Desire and longing are not the same thing. Sufism understands this. Christianity understands this. C.S. Lewis understood this. Lewis was always saying, think about C.S. Lewis. He loves a pint. He loves a walk. He loves a smoke. He loves a laugh. No book too long. That's what he said.
mm,
But no cup of tea too long. But on the other hand, he said, if you really get to grips with what Christ is talking about, there's this place farther out and further in, this really wonderful thing that is beyond. And so Rumi, the great Persian poet Rumi, would say, the sensation of longing in your heart is God speaking back to you. It is the return message. All teenagers should know that. All teenagers should know that when they have their first agony of unrequited love, they have entered divine ground. And actually, the very ache itself is calling to them in some way. But we are not privy to this kind of wisdom anymore. Carl Jung, he's a sort of problematic figure in a way, but had genius, no matter what. Carl Jung said the times we're living in, the times you have just described,
mm,
are so complex we shouldn't even think of approaching them without what he calls the lament of the dead. Now, do note that is not Jung claiming we need to have a seance. What that is Carl Jung saying we need ancestral wisdom at our side, because one person hunched over a laptop in Hoxton is not going to figure it out.
Mm.
And so, to circle back to your original inquiry, yes, I think many of the discussions and the activism that's going on about the monsters and the machinery of the West, it's a spirited idea, but until beauty has entered the frame, the soul is not really roused. It's a sense of moral obligation or moral outrage, but it's not necessarily a stirring of the heart. It's not
Mm.
beautiful enough. And we know through cultures all over the world that beauty matters. As an Orthodox Christian, if I walk into divine liturgy, I have immediately moved from profane time into sacred time. What Mircea Eliade, the mythologists from the last century, used to call it the myth of the eternal return, because as soon as you step into that frequency, you are not just in a reenactment of Eden or some memory of things. You are in a place where heaven and earth are meeting. That's what the liturgy, divine liturgy, actually is. And so we need our artfulness, we need our discipline, we need our structure, we need order. Um, People who've studied my work for a long time tend to gravitate, and I understand why they do it, towards when I address, well, as we mentioned, I lived in a tent for 4 years. I have a sense of what that's like. No screens, nothing. I just went. I wasn't blogging, I can assure you, as I did it. I wasn't kind of waving over the hill. I was gone. That has fundamentally rewired and changed me. I was a different person that walked out of the other end of that experience. But I knew the myths tell us you cannot abdicate the conditions of your time. That's dereliction of duty. You
Yeah.
understand? Dereliction of duty. So you have to show up, but you have to show up with some artfulness, with some playfulness, and with some religious muscle.
Yeah. This was a quote I brought up with Jonathan Pajot when I spoke to him recently. I brought up St. Isaac the Syrian,
Yeah.
and he has this remarkable quote, which says that what's more powerful than 1,000 armies is a quiet heart in the wilderness, something like that. And there's been so much talk recently, and you mentioned the monsters at our gates, or the things that are happening at the moment. But there has been so much talk lately about saving the West, saving Western civilization, and I think for many, what that has meant is just spend more time on Twitter complaining. And I was just wondering whether you have felt that these conversations about saving the West are starting to feel a little bit tedious, or whether we are barking up the wrong tree. And I was wondering, what wisdom you think we can gain from the saints, from the biblical stories, when it comes to how we even approach this, especially with St. Isaac's quote in mind.
Okay, so there's at least three questions in there.
Yeah.
Let's start with St. Isaac. So he says a very radical thing. Was the phrase he used, a pure or a quiet heart?
I think it's a pure heart in the
A
wilderness.
pure heart in the wilderness. Okay, easier said than done.
Yeah.
Easier said than done. A very, very radical proposition. One of the one of the relentless messages of Jesus Christ is this: will you please stop worrying? He says it all the time. Will you please stop worrying? And we're not good Christians if we're stressed all the time. We're just not. And actually, what we learn from orthodoxy is you never defeat demons by talking about them constantly. You focus on the opposite. You focus, you focus on Yeshua. You focus on the saints. You focus on the best of church tradition, patristic teachings, and you focus on the presence of the Holy Spirit, for goodness sake. That's what you do. And that's when miraculous things happen. So, so that's the first thing. Actually, it's an incredibly complex ask that he's saying. Most of us are not going to get anywhere near that. But there's someone else called Elder Thaddeus who wrote an amazing book, or it's a book compiled of really of his sayings. I think the title is Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives. And he's saying the same thing, that if there isn't some kind of interior peace, the Jesus prayer is no good at all if it isn't being prayed from your heart. If it's being prayed from the wrong part of your psyche, or your mind needs to live in your heart. That's a very Christian idea. So, first of all, that's best, what he's saying is what all true asceticism should lead to. Okay, so we'll move on a bit now. This whole business about civilization, the West, etc., I can go with it for a while because to a degree I'm a product of it, but I'm immediately um, anxious about that because I am so thoroughly stewed in what people would call indigenous wisdom. I'm so thoroughly edified and informed by cultures that are nothing to do with what we now call Europe or that whole place. Um, and so I know what they're getting at. I know it's about the fundament of a certain moral system, a certain Christian system that is we've attempted and failed at over and over again. You know, I still think most of the time we're living in pre pre-Christian culture. It hasn't happened yet. We haven't
Yeah.
really given it a good stab. That would be an orthodox idea, I think. So no, I'm not excited by it, but you mentioned a word. There's lots of, you know, you get to middle age, everybody has any number of descriptions you can give of yourself, doctor this, writer that, etc. I'm a very ordinary West Country mystic, and I am living out of that consciousness. And it may be that if I'm lucky enough to live for another 6 years and I get to 60, I may just go back out into the bush again. This may be it. This may be the glimpse. I can feel the pull of that as I get older again. I did it once, as I said, for 4 years when I was younger, and I can feel it again as I get older. But I would go further now. So yeah, not wildly sold on the whole Western thing. Although I love, of course, Greek mythology. I love the Arthurian tradition. I love Irish myth and the rest of it. But there can be a tone. There can be a tone in the end that is a little too far right leaning for my comfort. You
Yeah,
know.
yeah, I know what you mean. And yeah, I was speaking to Vespa Stamper, who I think is also working with you on something at the
Yeah.
moment recently,
Yeah.
and she wrote this article and she mentioned this idea that, it's not the end of Christianity, but the end of Christendom, and that actually most people haven't rejected Christianity, but have never really heard of it, to be honest, and it's not really something they've been exposed to. But I want to talk a little bit just before we move on about the British myth and about the British folklore and what has invigorated British culture for a long time since we're both, both born in the UK. You said once that when England starts to lose its centre, it's to the green margins we go. And it's characters like Robin Hood that wake up a primordial conscience in us again. And I love that image. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that just a little bit, and what you think turning to the green margins really looks like today in our modern world, or even whether you think just because we're doing that is necessarily the right thing that we should do.
Beautiful. Yeah. Again, two or three things happening there. So first of all, I always see Robin Hood and King Arthur as weird twins. So King Arthur is the center of the Round Table. He's the center of Camelot. Interestingly, if you really study the Arthurian romances, which is a slightly later iteration of them, they're flip-flopping around in English consciousness from the 6th century, but 600 years later, when they ironically are carried back into Norman France, what we now call France, they take on a more elaborate field, and the notion of something which I'm very fond of, chivalry, arrives. And the chivalric tradition, actually, if we were to talk about the West, is something that I think has real value and beauty attached to it. What people do not realize about the chivalric tradition is it has an Islamic influence in it. Ho, 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 ho. So just as people are getting saying this is the ultimate Christian vehicle, that is true, but good Christians used to talk over what we now call the Pyrenees to Moorish Spain. And a lot of the appreciative consciousness of the poets of the 12th century comes from actually Islam. So I don't like it when people suggest to me that they've never met a reasonable Muslim. You know, you get this all the time in the propaganda about the dreadful state that England is in. And it is and it isn't. It is and it isn't. And I've been around great diversity of culture here. And it isn't always race riots. It's not always screaming racism. Actually, people have learnt in many different situations to rub along together, to get on, to figure it out, and to hold on intrinsically to what there was very important to their culture and their religion.
Mhm.
It's not all the stuff that you read on the television.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was the first thing. What were you asking me about? It was yeah. What does it look like? The greening conscience. Well, here's an example. I have a I go I have a priest that I go to, Father Porphyrius, and Father Porphyrius, his day job is as a psychiatrist, and he's there in church on a Sunday doing divine liturgy, but he's also he said my version of going out into the desert is walking far out with people that don't want to live anymore and listening to them. So in other words, if you want to think about what it means to get to the very edge, the greening edge of your own conscience, of course that can be a literal thing, spend more time in nature, but I would ask you to think symbolically and metaphorically about the conditions of your own life. How could you find a way? What does desert mean to you? What is out there? There's something harsh about the desert. There's something where things get stripped away about the desert. There's something dangerous about the desert, but there's also something transformative about the desert. So, thinking symbolically and metaphorically about the conditions of one's life is a way of beginning, in a very natural sense, to experience meaning again. And there is a meaning crisis for people. I was talking to Paul Kingsnorth actually a few days ago. He's an old mate of mine. And I was saying how often these days, if I'm on a bus and I look out and I'll see a park bench, I'll see a kid leaning down, like looking into their lap. Now, that's a very kind of interiorized thing to do. And the sad thing is, 25 years ago, if I'd seen that, I'd think, oh, that lad's thinking about his girlfriend. He's missing somebody. He's missing
Mhm.
somebody. But of course, he's not missing anybody. He's on his phone. That's what he's doing. That's what everybody is doing. That is what everybody is doing. And that is the gaze of Narcissus in a myth. That is the thing that is absolutely going to trap you. So, a thing you mentioned about 15 minutes ago is, do we all chuck our phones away? Well, that could be a start. Uh, a f- I have I have labored over this point, so forgive me for saying it yet again. We all need to make a covenant with limit. If we are in a culture that is seducing us by feeding our desires and cutting away our longings, which is, in orthodoxy, we know there's a time to feast and a time to fast. Modernity has no interest in fasting whatsoever, unless it's to become like a supermodel, skinny.
Right.
So, what do we do with our phones? Well, again, you have to, limit your access to them. Don't use them after 8 o'clock at night. Have some sort of, go back to a brick, whatever it is. But I am not really, honestly, in favor of a kind of enormous Amish move to the margins, really. I'm just not that. I'm too nuanced as a person. Here's a
Mhm.
word for us, pharmacon.
Mhm.
Pharmacon means poison and it means remedy, and it's all one thing. And my life is an exploration of the pharmacon, not because I want to be around the poisonous, but because I do understand paradox. I understand that we are having to use the machine to have this bloody conversation in the first place. And
Precisely.
so
Yeah.
be careful about these big blanket statements that we're constantly making about, the degree of peril we're in, where actually what is always being called for is discernment. Now, what does that look like in a myth? In a myth, when you're in the underworld, you will often be presented with grain, a big pile of grain, thousands and thousands of bits of grain. This happens in a story called Psyche and Eros. And your task is to separate out the grain that is uh, dark and rotten and the stuff that is edible. And you're going to be frightened when you're in the underworld and you're going to be overwhelmed. But what you have to do is take a breath, sit down, breathe, and just slowly and unhysterically start to separate the grains out. This is a phenomenal image for where we are right now. And you have to have allies. That's what we find in myth when you're going to do that. If you think you can do it on your own, you are going to have a meltdown. But in the
Mm,
stories, there'll always be an ally or somebody that comes with you, usually in the form of an animal or a presence. Somebody will do that work with you, and together something impossible gets realized. But it's about discernment. It's about, as they say in the Bible, testing the spirits of the age,
mm.
but not running
Is this what
away from the age entirely.
yeah. Is this what you were referring to when it comes to cultivating your imagination? I think it was that the word you used? You have you put parameters on what you're seeing from the
Yeah,
culture. Like you put blocks out there.
yeah.
And I was wondering, in terms of like whether that's a general rule or whether there's any literal or practical means by which you've gone about doing that i- in a world where we're all in a sense we're leaning on on the internet, we're leaning on those things to put out our work, and it can be really uh, um, difficult to understand where the threshold is for you or for me or for anyone. And I'm wondering, like, is this like a daily kind of is this a meditation? Is this something that you have a technique for, or is this just a general rule?
Don't have a television. Just
Mm,
don't. It's a babysitter with some horrible opinions. If you're a parent, don't
yeah.
put your kids in front of screens. Just don't do it. Cut it out today. Cut it out. Uh, I haven't had a television in the house in any real way for about 20 years. Um, I love movies. I love old movies. I've been watching a few movies. Watch a film called Atanajuat, The Fast Runner. Watch Gadjadillo, a film about gypsies. Watch the best film of all time called Derzu Ursula by Kurosawa.
Yep.
I'm watching The Red Shoes at the moment, an old film from 1948, which is the fairy tale of that. So, in other words, again, you see, it's Pharmacon time. You'll get people who
Mm,
say all movies are Luciferic, all stories that don't pop up in the Bible are of the devil. Why are you steering everybody away, Martin, to a myth or a fairy tale when you should just be banging on all the time in this particular mode? But that mode, that kind of chapter and verse thing. I mean, the Bible is the most luminous thing imaginable for me, but I've had to come at it at a much later age, and I've had to have, God, for some reason, has decided to give me a slightly different vocabulary, but to go back to the eternal present. That's a great way of thinking of, yeah. The Bible is eternally present. Every time I open it, it's happening. It's happening.
yep.
It's all
Yep.
event. Everything in the Bible is event. It is and it isn't to do with a long time ago.
Mm.
Anyway, I've lost the thread, you'll be pleased to know.
No, no, we're just talking. Well, in terms of curating the
Oh
kind
yeah.
of information
Yeah,
you
yeah,
see.
yeah, yeah, that's it. So for example, and I would get up every day. I start to wake up at 6:30. I'm often writing by about 8 o'clock. Between 8 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the afternoon, unless Jesus himself has landed in Trafalgar Square, don't ring me. Do not contact me in any way. Don't ask me anything. Don't come to the door. It's just stay away. Stay away. And so I show another of my favorite words, fidelity to my tiny set of gifts that God has given me. And I sit there and say, okay, I'm open for business. Let's go. And so I lean into that. So I'm kind of disciplined with my time. I'm disciplined with my friendships. I don't have 1,000 friends. I have a great collection of about 15 who I adore, and some reason they care about me too. We're not meant to know more than about 30 people naturally. Historically, we only knew, and now we're meant to know 30,000 or
Yep.
3 million. That's how you create a culture of ghosts, not ancestors. See, that, my friend, is indigenous wisdom. That didn't
Mm,
come out of Europe. That's tribal juice. That
mm,
is. If you, and it comes back to that First Nations idea of having your photograph being taken too many times. You get thinned in some way that they would really understand. You probably are familiar with Ian McGilchrist.
yep.
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 So McGilchrist's work on the right and the left brain, especially his extraordinary books, The Matter with Things, that's, he's arguing all the time And he'd laugh at that. He'd say, I have to argue from the left brain to promote the right brain. But what I'm trying to do in my own work organically is to be around beauty, is to be around story, is to be a man of skill, to have skills. And actually, the way I can most help other people is not to become a thinned out YouTube pundit on every single issue that's being chucked in front of me every day, but I live in a dimension of consciousness where myth is foreground, not background. And so, what I can do, because I want to be helpful, is to come in and just listen to any situation and say, do you know what? That reminds me of a fairy tale. Have you ever heard of the Six Swans? Have you ever heard of Tatterhood? Have you ever heard of that moment in the story of Parsifal? And something slows in people, and the blood pressure drops, and we're into there's different types of time, you see. That's the problem. We continually think that all time is the same, but time is not the same. Storytellers, remember once upon a time. Well, there's
Mm.
also once below a time. There's once around a time. There's once before a time was strapped on your wrist as a digital watch. There's a time before time was stretched on the rack of infinite progress. There's another kind of time. And that kind of time is Kairos time, not Chronos.
Mm.
Chronos time is school runs, bills, and facts of the matter. Kairos time is a divinely appointed moment, where something wonderful happens and you experience what the anthropologist Victor Turner used to call communitas. And it's this bristling, collective, holy moment where we know we have stepped out of ordinary time.
Mm. It's so interesting you say that. Jonathan Pajot, again, to bring him up again, has this phrase that symbolism happens. It just happens. You can't avoid it. And I've been thinking about this conversation we're going to have today for the past few days. And the other night, I was woken up by my daughter in the middle of the night. I don't know what time it was, and I went to go check my watch, and it was dark. So I pressed the light on, and I actually had to use the light to look around the room because it was pitch black. And then I lost my way again. I pressed it again, and it had died. And since then, I've not been wearing a watch around my wrist, my body feels lighter for it. It's very strange to have this kind of strap of time taken off my body. Um, so first of all, that's just a very interesting thing that you bring up. Um, Now, just in this era of what we're talking about, um, throwing away the TV and all that kind of stuff, I do think about how this is changing us, whether that be the way we are cowered over like narcissists on the park bench or on the school bus or whatever it is that we're all looking at our phones, but how this is even meaning that children are being raised watching their parents on their phone. I'm terrible at it as well. I find myself reaching for the phone when I don't need to be. And whereas we used to have a landline and people that could reach you there, now we don't have landlines and we're just always available. And I love that you have this some kind of discipline that between a certain hour of the day, just don't reach me. I'm not going to pick up the phone and just bugger off kind of thing. I was wondering, I think you're a father, correct? Am I right in saying that? You've got
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
how have you seen the modernity of things change the relationship between a parent and a child? Saint Anthony the Great has a great quote that might be good to bring up now. He says that there was a time a time is coming when men will go mad, and when we see someone who is not mad, they will attack him. And it kind of feels like that time at the moment. But it does feel like we've all gone mad and we've forgotten the way things used to be. And people that are trying to be the way we used to be without TVs, you call them mad. And I guess there's a lot there, but I was wondering if you could, I don't know, give your insight into that as a father who's already done it, and now I've got young kids. What to watch out for.
Yeah. Well, to repeat something I think I probably said at the beginning, that in the end, we're killing ourselves. We're in a kind of protracted suicide attempt with our own culture. It's extraordinary. There's an Irish phrase which I think is almost up there with the Orthodox phrase theosis, or the Orthodox word theosis. It's called "cop onto yourself." Just cop onto you idiot. You know, who sets fire to their own house? We set fire to our own house. So yeah, we are blind, and we lack, as we go blinder, at the very least, we need a braille to decipher the strangeness of our times, and myth is the thing that has always done that. So I have a daughter that is thoroughly versed in myth. She can tell the stories. She didn't just read them, she was told them, all of them, when she was a kid. So she has this great, luscious, uncorralled, free range imagination when it comes to stories, and she's able to give mythic context to the travails of her own life, which as a young woman in her early 20s are real.
Mm.
Of course, the issue for all parents is when the kid says, I want a phone, and you can give me the phone or I will find that phone. But, absolutely that phone is going to happen. And I will always ponder how efficiently I stewarded that moment or didn't. I did my very best with it. We had a little we had a little glass bowl that we would put our phones into, and while those glass bowls were glass phones were in the phones were in the glass bowl, we just had ourselves, and it was amazing knowing we didn't have access. We were I sent her a picture once, or a drawing actually, of like a cave scene. Like you immediately feel like this, you're back to the beginning of things. The moment, I said to her, just practice turning it off.
Mm.
Just practice turning your phone off. A lot of kids literally never turn their phone off, and then when they go to bed, they slip it under their pillow.
Mm.
Dreadful. So I'm not sure. I tried to do my best with that, but I want to encourage all parents to put in the labor when the kids are younger, because part of the travail and the separation of adolescence is there will come a point where you really ponder, has this child inherited anything of use from me at all? And for a few years, if the kid is doing their work efficiently, they will give you no signals that they've inherited of any value from you. But let me tell you, the really deep stuff gets seeded and starts to grow. And suddenly you'll notice that the child has a moral backbone that you didn't suspect. They make difficult decisions, not easy decisions, and you see the beginning of maturity in them. And you can start seeding that into them through stories. Don't just read them stories, tell them stories. Imagine out loud in front of them, and that in their way gives them permission to do the same. I mean, kids do it naturally when they're very young, but as they approach adolescence, self consciousness descends and they stop doing that. But that kind of inwardness that you get in adolescent kids, in Norse mythology, it's called becoming a cinder biter. And you're a cinder biter when at adolescence you lie by the fire and you dream. And so when my daughter, as is frequently her wont, sleeps till 1 o'clock in the afternoon, uh, rather than going in there and trying to sort of fill her up with orange juice and march her out on a jog, this is just her time to be a cinder biter. I used to do exactly the same thing. Allow that passage to happen because it is a passage and it will pass.
Mm. That's really great. Thanks for the parenting advice because yeah, my kids are very young at the moment. I've got a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 6-week old. And so some of this
Wow.
stuff is on my horizon. Um, yeah, we've been productive. um, Now, I wanted to talk about being a creative as well, and this was something I was speaking to Vespa as well about as well, and she was kind of hinting maybe I should ask you this because she was curious about this as well. But I think in the same way that I've admired, particularly other Orthodox Christian creators, but there's other creators from different backgrounds and faiths, how they've been able to conduct themselves online and not slip into being this kind of reactive person who's constantly doing reaction videos to the latest thing, which the temptation for me is there as well. I've got a social media account and every day the temptation is there to put something out that has to do with the world. And I've over the last few months found myself wanting to do something different and focus more on beauty and that kind of stuff. But one of the things I have admired about you is the way you've conducted yourself. And I don't know whether it's just come naturally to you, but you know, you your work as a creative and a storyteller, it never feels cliche. It never feels performative for the heck of it. It feels real and grounded. And I was also wondering how you kind of navigate this world where there's constant pressure on artists to become activists. where you have to become politically performative, and well, particularly that's the case online. I'm just wondering how you've kind of navigated that and held down your own paradigm that you're not going to slip into that.
I suspect I suspect in the end we will get cultural fatigue of that kind of commentary.
Mm,
I do. I think that there's a shelf life to it.
mm,
And I think there's a difference between being timely and timeless.
mhm,
And I'm interested in the timeless bit. And the timeless bit, if you show fidelity to that, in other words, the most profound truths that are circulating, you inevitably hit the timely. But if you only rattle around in the timely, if you only rattle around with, well, if I say this about Ukraine or Gaza or Trump, I'm going to get more hits, then there's something shrill and a little desperate in your delivery. They say desperation is the world's worst cologne. Uh, it's, you can kind of smell it off people. And it's
mm,
interesting, more and more now, I see, people in the online world talking about myth, but they're not actually embodying anything. They are theorizing. They're talking around myth. They're not actually telling stories. And so, thank you, first of all, for what you've observed.
mm.
And it's just my temperament. It's just what I'm
Okay.
like. It's my
Yeah.
sensibility. It's what I'm
Yeah.
trying to protect.
Yeah.
I come from being around what they used to call medicine men,
Yeah.
traditional spiritual teachers who are terribly, here's a phrase, mode of approach. How do you approach an old story? How do you approach an old idea?
Mm,
Uh, how do you enter living myth? These things require etiquette and they require respect. And you're not out there cheaply selling anything. Don't sell anything. Don't sell anything. Um, just don't. Just, you know, as I said before, find your wild way of trying to tell the truth about things. Because I have a theory that when we die and suddenly there's Peter and he's got the keys to heaven, he'll say, I can't let you in, you smell of the internet.
yeah, that's a great one. That's a good line.
You
That's a
know,
great one.
and so I'm not keen for that. I'm not
Yeah.
keen for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and look, like I do notice it in your work that you are the best way I can describe it is like there's this big temptation, like there's this big bowl of candy right in front of you. And you said it perfectly, between the timeless and the timely. And the internet thrives on the timely. Who can get the latest news story out, who can do the latest reaction video. And, I've been from my background as a filmmaker, I've gone online over the last sort of 6 months to post, and what I've noticed is that there is this kind of dragon of the algorithm that's trying to pull out. I don't know if the dragon's the right archetype, mythological archetype, but there's something dragging you into something like the serpent with Eve. Go on, it's going to be all right. Don't you want to be all powerful? Don't you want all the clicks? And I can feel it myself, just feeling like this isn't good for me. This isn't good for other people. It's kind of like a drug dealer relationship where you're giving the dopamine hits, and people are then investing more time in that crouched over position. And what you really want to do, especially when you walk into an Orthodox church, is you suddenly have this looking up feeling, this kind of raising up. And I've also thought as a father as well, just in a sort of in a more narrow sense, do I want my kids seeing my videos in 10, 20 years or 30 years, or maybe when I'm dead, and seeing, well, look, my father, all he did was react to the world? Or did he do something a little bit different, a little bit more timeless, as you'd say?
Yes.
Um,
Okay. Yeah. So in other words, did my father make beauty or not?
mm,
Not
mm,
not even react to beauty. Did he actually make it? In
mhm,
Russian fairy tales, if you're trying to court the woman that lives at the very edge of the world, who's often called Vasilisa, and is often seen as the soul itself, the only thing she responds to is beautiful things that have been slowly made by hand. The rest is
mm,
nonsense. If you turn
mhm,
up and say, I'll just ping you over 50 grand, she's going to give you a tap to the head that you thoroughly deserved. What she wants to see is somebody who is equated to patience and to failure has been humbled, has got up, has had another crack at it, and has gradually beheld, the radiance of the world, and so through their art form. And so yeah, you've got here's some advice for everybody. Be very cautious of low hanging fruit. Be very cautious of the quick route. I bear I bear a fairly considerable price for the things you just praised me for.
Hmm.
I'm not at all where I could be in terms of visibility because I do this. I am fairly frequently counseled by people who said, if you just made a few adjustments, my boy, you know, you're the next, etc., etc. But you can't be in the game for those reasons. That can't be the legacy, not for me.
Yeah. And I've got to say, this evolution in my thought process has had a lot to do with entering into the orthodox river, as it's, I think, a good way of putting it. It's like an ancient stream that feels like it's been going forever. And when you enter it, it knocks you around, it carves new channels in you, and it erodes some stuff away. And one of the things I absolutely, well, I say love, but it's not like a kind of, oh, I love this favorite drink. It's a burden in a sense, but is the concept of theosis. And it's gotten to the point as well for me, and I don't know whether this has been the same for you, but it's almost like, is this on the path to theosis? Is creating this actually just chucking me a few further rungs down the ladder, so to speak, or is this on the way up? And that's what it's kind of become. And I'm not there yet, but I can feel like the wild is calling you back again into solitude. It feels like that. I think the kind of films and the kind of conversations and stuff I want to be doing, it's a little bit different than what I guess the world is asking you to do. And yeah, I recognize that because look, at the beginning of this conversation, I started off by saying I'm a massive fan of the Jawbone podcast,
Mm.
and anyone who discovers it is just thrilled, and that's the case. It really is like you're not going for those low hanging fruits. It's like a discovery, and I found actually orthodoxy to be like that. I hadn't heard of orthodoxy, so what on earth is this? And when you discover it, it doesn't feel like low hanging fruit. It feels very high up the tree. Um, so first of all, I was wondering, has entering orthodoxy or finding orthodoxy been anything like that for you?
Yes, I wouldn't want to describe it as entirely sort of starry-eyed. I'm
Yeah.
not new to Christianity.
No.
My father would be a preacher, and my mum and my dad have been reading the Bible yearly all the time since 1970. So
Mm,
it's the tonal vibration of the house that I grew up in. My brother is a pastor of a large church in Norwich. My sister is, I always describe her, my beautiful sister is a Catholic powerhouse with 7 children over in Walsingham. So kind of entering orthodoxy is both thrilling and familiar, I hope, because there are, if you can circle around the creed, then that's the thing that a lot of Christians can talk over their heads, depending on. I don't like things that are heavily sectarian in Christianity because I've been around that ride before. I've been around those arguments before.
yeah.
But I think the wonderful thing for me about Paul talks about there's a point in everyone's religious life where you need to move from milk to meat. Orthodoxy is meat, and orthodoxy is bigger and older than you are, and you have met an immense, mystical, mysterious, exacting discipline. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I know it's real because about once every 6 months, I don't want to do it anymore. And I'm fed up with it. And I go,
Right.
oh, if I could just be a Quaker, things would be so much easier. And then I deepen the practice, I pray more. The, my dreaming always changes, interestingly, when I'm really working hard with the within the parameters and the challenge of orthodoxy. I become a deeper dreamer.
Mm,
So the dreams change. So interestingly for me, there part of the reason that I know there's grit in the mill is, as Joe Campbell always said, we all gag on true doctrine, and there are things about orthodoxy that I find difficult and challenging at times. And sometimes I just don't want to go to church. And I go, oh, I'd rather go and sit by a river or a mountain. I've been talking recently about the difference between nature church and church nature. Now, what does that mean? When I was younger, the place I went if I had a spiritual or a practical problem was nature. Because nature, you know, the call of a crow from a tree, the movement of a river, the gospel of a cormorant, as I always say, all of that, it heals and calms something in me. But if I go into an old church with the same issue, it intensifies. It doesn't immediately let me off the hook. It's a different thing. It's a kind of it heats things up. That's the nature of church, not church nature. So
Mm.
for me, human churches and the wild are not interchangeable. They don't do the same thing. But mercifully, and this is something we learn from the story of the woman at the well, if you're really listening to it, Jesus says you can pray in both those places and you can pray anywhere. It's not absolutely defined in one place.
Yeah. Well, now feels like a good time to talk about Wild Christ, actually, if you unless you wanted to continue on that.
Yes, love to. Carry on.
So, you've often described Christ as wild, as this unpredictable fugitive from birth, and that God is unable to be tamed and fit into a box. But for many on the outside looking at the Orthodox Church, as we've just been discussing, it does appear to be this firm container for Christ, a kind of conservative, rigid structure with very firm dogma and boundaries. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about your experience in the Orthodox Church, maybe some of the paradox of that, and maybe some of the ways that the wildness is actually shining through in huge ways.
Sure. One of the things that's always makes me smile wryly about orthodoxy from a distance is people say, "Well, where are the women? Where are the women?" Uh, and if anybody's ever actually been part of an Orthodox community for 5 minutes, you're going to know exactly where the women are pretty quickly. And if you've ever been part of a divine liturgy and you've realized how much of the architecture of that experience is led by the choir, which is usually filled with women, it is an absolute back and forth between the masculine and the feminine from beginning to end. It's a cultural issue. It's a cultural issue. We just see it's like our addiction to the microphone, oh well that's where the power is. No, it's a much more subtle form, but women are all over orthodoxy for sure. Um, so I often feel that orthodoxy from a distance is not terribly indicative of what it's like when you get inside the thing. When you get inside the thing, you're into a tradition that in one hand is formal and ancient, and on the other is a bit anarchic and spontaneous and not really into rehearsing anything. Anybody that knows orthodoxy, there's not mad loads of rehearsals, you're in.
Right.
And so that's really interesting. When I was a catechumen, I said, "Oh, how many books should I read?" And Father Porphyrius put his hand up to me and said, "No reading, no reading. You can't
Wow.
read. You're going to turn a religious encounter into a religious theory really quickly if you do that. I
Mm.
want you to imitate." Because orthodoxy is a very physical tradition where, there's the kissing of icons, the lighting of candles, there's the prostrations, there's the fasting. Sometimes you stay up all night. These are felt disciplines in the body, and you feel your way. You feel your way into, and the center of that is this notion of gradually lowering your prayer life from your brain into your mind and your mind into your heart. So I wouldn't advise, to be honest, watching lots of YouTube Orthodox people because anybody can have a YouTube channel and anybody can talk about Orthodoxy. You'd want to know what diocese they're connected to, what denomination, what's really going on, what their background is. A guy with a beard and in black, look, I could look like one of those folks, but I'm too you realize I'm just too much of a pirate straight away. It's like, oh yeah, that's not a priest. Uh, although I was in a car with some Russians once, and they said to me, they said, we don't think you are a priest, but maybe you are a monk. So it's
That's
very
great.
sweet of them to make a distinction between the difference. But orthodoxy is there's more imagination in it than you may expect. There's more mystery in it than you may expect. Uh, but orthodoxy is not bent over trying to evangelize to you every 5 minutes.
Mm.
That's a very Western iteration of orthodoxy. If you're heavy on promotion. Now, wild Christ. Is Christ wild? Yes, he is, but he's also lots of other things as well. The reason why I've emphasized the notion of the wild Christ is simply because I think that hasn't been up close and center as a reality for people to realize how frustrating and radical he was, even for his own disciples. His own disciples, who, by the way, most of them were about the age of a youth club following him around, other than Peter, they're not really privy to what's unraveling in front of them right up to the last days in Jerusalem, like moments before he dies. There's mass confusion. And you've got this storyteller wandering around. You've got this, I say this in the most Christian of forms, the most profoundly shamanic figure you could possibly imagine. That's why indigenous cultures recognize Jesus frequently, because he's the wounded healer par excellence. They go, oh, we know what that guy is. We understand that really Christ is a great crow. Christ is a crow that has come down to suck the sorrow out of the world in the most spectacular act of love. That's what Christ is.
Mm.
I really wish someone had just said that to me when I was 8. The trajectory of my life would have changed.
Yeah.
It also seems too complicated. What do you mean there's a Trinity? How does that work? You
Yeah.
know, Jesus, everybody that Jesus touched in his life left people changed, but also troubled. This is
Mm.
not an easy character. So the reason I lean into the wildness, as you've heard me say before, born a fugitive, dies an outlaw, has the audacity to return, has something of the trickster in him, is thin-skinned, he's under pressure. Um, in the last week of his life, and you get this in the Gospel of John, moves from these very trim, strange little biblical story, his parables. My friend Mark Vernon says those parables are designed to melt your head. They're not even designed to quite make sense. They're designed to rattle the cage of your consciousness. And then, of course, when he gets to Jerusalem and he's fixing to die, that's when Christ as megalomaniac comes out. That's when Christ says, I'm paraphrasing now, I am Paleolithic Christ. I am Christ before Abraham. I am Christ before Moses. I'm Christ before, I am, so if you really think that isn't wild, you have not had the message transmitted appropriately to you. That's what I
Mm.
think.
Yeah. And you said something, you wish someone had told you that when you were, 8 years old or something. And I feel the same. Because I think, there are so many people right now that are going through personal crises that are, doing this alone. There's no elders, there's no rites of passage, there's no baptism, there's no guidance. And people are left just to stumble forwards in their own struggles and trials without a divine frame to look at it at through, you know,
Mm,
without any encouragement to bear their cross, or that there is even a cross, and that something called glory could actually come about through meaningful suffering. And I guess I was wondering if someone is finding themselves in that position today with no guide and no map, without chucking the Bible at them and saying, "Oh, go visit an Orthodox church or something," what would be something that you would say to them? What would be that first bit of advice?
First bit of advice would be this: entertain the notion that God is your conscience. Start there. Pay attention to your conscience. Pay attention to the eccentricity of your conscience, the sense of right and wrong. That's a good place to start with people who say, I can't deal with the notion of Jesus. I can't deal with Christianity. Who cares what it's called? Who cares whether you're called a Christian or not? It wasn't even a word that Christians came up with. The Romans invented it to describe them. They were followers of the way. I'm part of the Jesus movement. Really, I'm just part of a cult of personality that's lasted for 2,000 years. So first of all, begin with the still small voice. Begin with your conscience. begin with begin begin with taking account and working out of the strangeness of that. In other words, if there's somebody that you've harbored resentment for, it's easy to do it if you've had a big row with them. But if you haven't, but you know that there's something blocked in the relationship with the two of them, find a way of addressing it. Even if they never cop onto it or say, I don't know what you're talking about, say, I need to tell you something, that I've been envious of you. I really have. And I don't want this to live between us anymore. And you may have picked up on it and you may have you haven't. But, I'm really sorry because there are times I've been less than charitable to you, etc. So that is a very radical energy. That's a very undefended energy to bring into your life. So first of all, entertain the notion that God is speaking through your conscience. And then secondly, in a slightly wider parameter than just Christianity, I'd say this: books are your grandparents. Books are your grandparents. In other words, in a culture where we are not receiving strong, solid, edifying rites of passage, go to the books, pick two teachers. That's what I'd say for everybody is, I don't know when this video will come out, whether this is going to be in late summer, but we're heading towards autumn. Pick two teachers for the winter that you're going to work into, and they shouldn't be living. They should be part of your honourable ancestral crew, and look back through time and have an active relationship. It's an awful thing to think that your community is entirely alive. You shouldn't go back to the saints. Go back to, if you want to be a good painter, study Caravaggio, study Jackson Pollock, study Rainer Maria Rilke if you're interested in poetry. If you're interested in romance and profound love, study Pablo Neruda. If you want to get grips with a really beautiful form of philosophy, read guy called Gaston Bachelard and his book, The Poetics of Space. I'm throwing as many keys as I can at this moment. I'm just throwing as many keys as I can. In other words, the notion that you have no teachers is unnecessarily savage.
Mm.
You're hurting yourself. Stop it.
Yeah.
You don't. You're surrounded by them. Every art gallery, every library is filled with ways of growing yourself back up.
Mm. You also had this great quote, and I don't want to keep throwing quotes of yours back at you, but it's so easy to because there's a lot of wisdom there. But you once said that a mythic understanding of the world isn't that you can be anything; it's that you're meant to be something quite specific, and
Mm,
that the only ground to really pay attention to is that little prayer mat beneath your feet. I'm still
yeah.
quoting you, by the way. There's more.
Mm,
But for most of us, the trance state of modernity is too strong to realize that. And it's only once you've been worn down and you're on your knees that you're in the appropriate position to actually notice that fact. And I was wondering whether, first of all, finding yourself worn down by the world is actually some great opportunity. Kind of going back to what you said at the beginning with the dying West, with the rise of X, Y, and Z happening, that this is actually a very, Pajot, again, he talks about this as being very fertile soil right now. So would you describe this catastrophe as actually being a silver lining to it?
well, it's always catastrophe. Things were always better at some time in the distance. I've been here since 1971, and I don't think there's ever a time which you could say weren't troubled in those,
Mm,
50, almost 54 years. That's an interesting quote that you just gave. I think it's from a book I wrote called Smoke Hole, and I can feel in it. That's written pre-conversion,
hmm.
but I can feel what's starting to happen even when you quote that back to me.
Okay.
It's no bad, I can feel the essential Christology in it. I can
Hmm.
feel that beginning to happen. It's funny actually. I mean, you'd have to be a very, very miserable character not to feel gratified when people quote your work to you. I support I love the work of an Irish philosopher called John Moriarty. And when Moriarty was dying, he said, "I feel I have no echo in the world,"
Mm,
and it was awful.
mm,
Mercifully, he has plenty of echo now. But there was
yeah.
a time I feel I have no echo in the world. And it's a normal, natural, and healthy thing to wish for echo, to wish, like, actually echolocation, like birds. You
Mm,
want to bump into other warm mammals. Life is a contact sport. I've often talked about it being a bit like a mosh pit, and then you get to a certain age and you want to turn the mosh pit into a flamenco dance, which is kind of what I'm up to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, I really recommend people do check out your podcast because they're going to find your voice echoing in their head, making their morning tea. Because there are so many of these great moments that stay with you. That's why I've just become such a huge fan and fallen in love with your work. But it is true that these moments where we're ground down do end up becoming those kind of milestone markers in your life that you think, well, if it wasn't for that, like nothing would have been the same again, or it's really transformed. It's been transformative. And I
Yeah.
actually, when I read that quote from you, when I heard that quote from you, I didn't realize it was pre-faith for you. I didn't realize it was pre-Christianity for you. And it was so striking in that quote that it just jumped out at me that it was such an obvious connection, and I hadn't realized that actually it wasn't.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. Years ago, when I used to work with people, I initially I was living in this tent, and three fellas turned up over a field and said, "You're obviously up to something. Can you teach us something?" I said, "Well, I'll do my best." And we
Mm,
all had sticks. I got everybody to go and get a little stick about that long, and I said, "That stick is the decades of your life so far." And we were all comparatively useful. We're in our 30s then. And I said, make a line in the stick every time you have what I used to call a crossroads moment, a moment of significant impasse, of weight, of heft. And gradually, the stick gets marked up between the big marks and the little marks. But I've talked a lot about the difference, just like I talk about the difference in types of time, I talk about the difference in terms of memory, and I talk about the difference between skin memory, flesh memory, and bone memory. And what we are missing in modern commentary about the times we're in is what I would call bone memory. Skin memory is last night, another 100 bombs landed in Ukraine and 300 people died. Terrible thing. Then flesh memory is the families who died, the people weeping over their dead. That's flesh memory. And then bone memory is what mythic forces are at place underneath this in the first place. And very few people are adept enough, can dive deep enough to give transmission from that kind of depth. But the
mm,
stories can do it, and the
mm,
stories do it without the use of I statements.
mm,
Everybody is included, everybody is invited in. So I would say to you, yes, of course, this is a time of tremendous potential. It is only in times of extraordinary duress, says the poet Goethe, it's only then that invisible forces will come to your aid. It is only then, when you proceed with some boldness, even in lieu of the facts that are being hurled at you, that something really remarkable can happen. So we have to take courage. And as Christians, I have to remind us we're still we're still bequeathed to something called the good news.
mm,
Good news.
mm. Evangelon. Yeah. Well, look, I want to talk about the good news, but also how do I put this? There's something that's present in bone memory that isn't in skin memory, and I think a lot of that has to do in the context of what I'm about to ask you, has to do with beauty and the good evil kind of thing, and that there is good, and it's skin memory. So much of what we're responding to does tend to be the bad news all the time. So we're seeing a lot of the bad all the time. Um, and I wanted to speak to you about beauty because you've described it as something that is preparing us for the eternal, as something that is necessary for the soul. And with that in mind, I was wondering, what you think so much of the movies and what we're consuming on TV and what's on advertising everywhere. I guess we're constantly living in that skin memory state. What do you think that's doing to a people? What do you think that's doing to all of us?
Making us mad, making us blind in a way. As I said, um, it's continually addressing the wrong part of our mind. There's a difference in mythology between spirit and soul. And as a culture, we're still quite good at spirit, but we're dreadful at soul. Spirit is Obama. Spirit is yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yeah, yes, we can. Uh, Soul is maybe we can't, or maybe it's too late, or maybe we need to grieve. And what on earth do we do with grief? In myth, I'm writing a book about this at the moment, which is why it's so present in my head. In myth, there are three colors that are very present: red, black, and white. And those colors can be identified with stages of development in our life: the red of youth, the black of midlife, the white of elderhood and sagacity, becoming wise. However, life is such a jumble, sometimes you're chucked straight into the black. Sometimes you don't have enough red. Sometimes you never get anywhere near the white. Sometimes you have a very wise 5-year-old who was born in the white. But these are the kind of useful handrails we need to educate ourselves when faced with what is around us. So what on earth, what is bone memory exactly? What could someone, what does that mean? What does it mean to be in touch with it? I can describe to you skin memory. Skin memory is: I'm born on October the 24th, 1971. In 1989, I worked in the cabbage fields of Lincolnshire in a small factory at the end of a kiln. Um, I have raised I have raised a child. Yeah, that's skin memory. Flesh memory is the divorce, the trouble, the depressions. And then bone memory is a way of talking. That is what James Hillman, I think I've already mentioned it, called the poetic basis of mind. And it's the hardest of the memories to talk about. To give you an image, the image could be of you. This used to happen where there would be a chick in a laboratory, and over this chick that's just been born, they would put the shadow uh, of a dove, no reaction. They'd put the shadow of a hawk, and the whole bird would change and be feared. How does the bird know to be frightened by a different type of shadow? What is going on in the bird at that moment? There's some sort of memory bank. I'm not claiming reincarnation or anything like that, but as humans, we simply need regularly to enter what I sometimes call pinpricks of eternity, because if we don't, life becomes, as I said, growingly more thinned out, and we lose our way.
Yeah. Now, if I can somehow find a connection to this, I doubt I will, but I wanted to talk about how icons um, feed into this paradigm of reality and a paradigm of viewing things, because it appears to me that our culture is obsessed with image. It's obsessed with everything we're seeing on our screens, on our phones. It's enticing, it's erotic, it's advertising, it's marketing, it's everything like that. But there's something about an icon which is like an antidote to that, which is like as you peer at it, as you view it, as you venerate it, it kind of it's like it's seeping into you in some way. I can't really quite describe it, but there's something going on with icons and with beauty. Um, and I don't know whether you had much to say about it.
Icons are very interesting. They're one of the problems for people outside of orthodoxy, because they think we're worshipping planks of wood.
Mm,
Of course, we're not. We're venerating them. The thing to know, of course, about an icon and the power of an icon, at the height of communism, I remember a priest once saying to me, "As long as one icon survives, orthodoxy can rebuild itself in that country. As long as there's one image." Now, of course, in the West now, we presume that everybody can read, but
mm,
not everybody could read
mm,
until fairly recently, certainly not all over the world. And the thing that an icon, of course, does, especially when your only exposure to biblical stories is in divine liturgy, there's not mad for Bible studies and cups of tea and all of that. And what do you think that is really being said in the blah blah? That's not that's not happening. An icon an icon is radiating something. It's a little bridge between heaven and earth, I suppose. I know a lot of friends of mine are becoming icon carvers, icon makers. I find them steadying energies to be around the house. I'm a painter myself, and I don't really have an iconic bone in my body. I have no instinct to make them myself. Um, but I love to be around them. I like anything that involves the sensual the sensual realm. I like things that use your hands and smells, and you kiss things and you look after things. And you, if you've ever been, when I'm in London, one of my great pleasures is to go to a place called Ennismore Gardens, which is a big, big Russian church, and the way that the women attend to the variety of shrines that are in that place is so absolutely gorgeous and so natural and so human. You go
Mm,
in and you can't see a thing for about 5 minutes. There's no real natural light. There's just hundreds and hundreds of candles and chanting and the smoke. It's absolutely intoxicating. And the predominant sensation you have when you walk into divine liturgy is, I'm desperate for this. I'm so
yeah.
hungry for this. How I can't walk another day in my life without
Mm,
this regular entering of this slipstream, this energy field.
yeah, absolutely. Um, is there any icons? I'm curious to know whether the particular icons that have caught your curiosity, that you keep coming back to, that you
I
think
mean,
about a lot, or have
I'm
changed
I'm
you in any way?
I'm surrounded by icons right
Okay,
now.
let's see them.
Well, I'll grab a few. Let me. Okay. Well, here's an icon.
Yep, describe it to us.
Well, this is an icon of a particular figure. Sorry, my eyes are so. This would be a fella that was out in Egypt in the he's early Orthodox Christian of the desert, but he also is somebody venerated in. His name changes slightly, but he's venerated in Italy and then moves, as is often the way with Orthodox saints. They sort of show up again in a slightly different form in Irish, early Irish saints. Paul Kingsnorth sent me this actually. I remember getting it through the post. Maybe,
Nice.
yeah, he did post it to me, bless his heart. Um, I call him Old Man Fed by Otters, which is not his Orthodox title. The reason I call him Old Man Fed by Otters is in the story of the voyage of Brendan, when they've left Ireland, these monks, and they've travelled for 7 years. It's an incredible story. They're almost at what I call Turtle Island, which is the old name for America, and they meet a man with a beard down to his feet who has been fed entirely by otters. Otters bring him fish every day. He's been there for 90 years without speaking, and he was sent there by Steel-eyed Patrick of the many conversions, St. Patrick. So that he's this isn't him, but it is him. There's a certain spirit in this fella. So I kiss him and I venerate him. So here's another one. Anybody will recognize that.
Yep.
That
So,
is our man. That's the forerunner. That's dear
that's
John the
right.
Baptist. That
Yep.
is
And
just
is there something about St. John the Baptist that speaks to you? He's a very mysterious figure. My 5-year-old is very interested in John the Baptist.
yeah. I mean, what's not to like? What's not to like about John the Baptist? Um, he's a radical, powerful. I mean, he when you think about the early desert fathers, John the Baptist, Elijah, Christ, of course, those are the kind of
Mm,
figures. They're digging into these rugged forms. This man, honey and locusts and the camel skin and all of that
mm.
stuff. Uh, do you remember there's a scene, well, not a scene, but there's a moment where he writes to Jesus and says, or sends a message, are you really, did I get this right? Did I
Mm,
get this right? And I find that, and it shows you what a strange character Christ is, because for some people, Jesus is not ascetic enough. He's not
right.
ascetic
Yeah.
enough. How can
Yeah.
you claim to be how can you claim to be Messiah when you are with the tax collectors and the hookers, and you're drinking
Right.
wine, and you're
Yeah.
doing that? And so he's Christ's never where you left him. Oh, I like that line. Going to write that.
Mm,
Christ is never where you put him down. He's always
yeah.
somewhere else.
He is.
That's
That's
today.
great, Martin.
That's
Love
today.
that line.
Christ is never where you feel. Yeah, he's independent. He's out. I remember. Do you remember at Orthodox we all say Christ is risen?
Yeah,
I remember once saying to a friend of mine, Richard Rollin, he said, "Christ is risen." I said, "He is indeed. He's out and about." And that's
yeah.
become part of certain Orthodox friends of mine. That's become part of the thing. He's out
I
and
love
about.
that. Yeah.
He's out and
I love that.
good. So
It's
anyway,
kind of like a very it's like a very British twist on a very sort of Greek, Christos anesti, Christ is risen. He's out and about. He's plodding
yeah,
around. I love that.
you got well the thing is you see as human beings we do have postcodes. I'm very interested in how orthodoxy in particular takes root because there is some kind of wild revival of it happening of which myself,
Mm,
Peugeot, Paul Kingsnorth, and a few others I think are fairly visible, especially through our sort of conversion experiences. Although to give Jonathan his credit, he's well stewed by now, far more than me and Paul. I'm interested in how a mystical Middle Eastern religion gets a grip really realistically in the Celtic landscape where I live.
yeah.
And, I sometimes feel that the universalism, the Great Commission of Jesus, it can get so universalized that I don't want to risk, I'm not asking for rampant nationalism, which is something that does crop up in Orthodoxy, but I do think attention to the trees and to the birds and to the rivers and the saints and that little bit of creation that you are curating this church is, or God is curating this church in, what does that look like? And you want to pay attention to it. I'm a big fan of the Ethiopian idea. Maybe it's an Ethiopian idea. Maybe I'm risking putting this idea in their head at this moment. Put it this way: lots of Ethiopian churches are surrounded by trees.
Mm,
And my poetic idea was, I think churches die of loneliness without trees.
mm.
And I would like to live in a world where every church had was within a little circle of trees, and you can
Yeah,
hear
it's a beautiful
animals.
image.
You can hear bird song, and I mean, you get this mercifully in a lot of churches. These are not new.
Martin, sorry to interrupt you. It's almost, I'm getting the image of Eden there because in the say Eden was, well, I've heard it be described as many things, but like a walled garden is one way some people have described it, with a tree in the middle and the walls, the brick and mortar around the outside. And in this sense, you've got the brick and mortar on the inside and the trees around the outside. Is a kind of new covenant kind of way of talking about that. There's just something about that image that I quite liked.
I love that image. I would also, the dream could be, could you imagine have a little church there, there's a stream that can kind of run into the church into a bowl so the baptisms could be coming from stream water, living water, like that,
Hmm.
and then in and then out again.
Yeah,
If anybody wants to find somewhere like that for me in the west of Britain,
yeah,
I would happily be the curator of it and do what I
yeah.
do what I could.
Well, because I was just reading Genesis and this idea of there being a great spring, like a great fountain that comes up and then goes in four different directions, or there's four different rivers, and the
Mm,
four rivers kind of spoke to me symbolically as like the four lines of the cross, right? The four different directions of the
yeah.
cross, and wouldn't that be wonderful at the center of the
They
church? There was a
do, and it also those four rivers indicate that it's possibly Eden is sort of slightly a mountain. It's kind of
Mhm,
they're coming down. Uh, One of the old Grail stories, Parsifal, which I wrote a book about called Snowy Tower, um, the notion that the Grail castle is on the Wild Mountain.
mm.
Wild Mountain for me is always another. It's one of my private. I anything I like, I give 12 secret names to that I don't tell anybody about. I have all these secret names for things. And for me, one of the secret names, and now I'm telling everybody, never done that before with this. My secret name for Eden is Wild Mountain.
Mm.
And yeah, there we
Well,
are.
thank you for sharing that, and let everyone know that you came up with it. And if you do a book on it, it's yours. And I think that's such a a beautiful idea of the wild mountain.
Mm.
Um, that's incredible. Speaking of mountains and this kind of idea of the wild, I did hear that you managed to get out to, is it Patmos or Greece, the cave
Yeah, yeah,
where
yeah,
John? Would
yeah,
you?
yeah.
I'd love to hear your experience there.
I've been to Patmos a couple of times now. and never been failed to be moved by the experience. And I feel I understand visually a little bit more of what's going on in the book of Revelation than before. There's just descriptions of colors and landscapes in there that I was like, oh, of course, this is what Patmos actually looks like. This is emerging from the pit. So there is in the center of Patmos there's a monastery connected to it now. There's basically a little cave which is said to have been, John's place where a lot of this came to him, and it's again you go in. The ground is kind of hollowed out by prostrations and centuries of pilgrims. Um, it's everything that I could possibly be looking for in a place because it's, as I said, it's kind of half cave, but there's an iconostasis, as I recall. There's a hidden area, and there's somebody always shuffling around polishing things. And it was interesting when I was at Patmos because I was in there alone. There was no one else in the cave other than me and a priest, or a monk actually. He wasn't a priest, and he was behind, and as I said, just polishing things and clearly very happy with his job, clearly couldn't be happier to be in this place. And I was thinking about, the visionary element, the prophetic element of John, and the pastoral element of this young monk. And I prayed, coming back to a word that you used about half an hour ago. I said, Yeshua, if at all possible, quite a slow theosis for me would be fine, because
Mm,
fast theosis can be extremely alarming, I think.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, and actually watching this monk, and I have to say, this monk came out and he looked more like a bandit, like he looked like a bandit, this fella. He was just wild. He was more goat than man. I was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. Can you imagine being part of a Christianity when fellas like that, they look like vagabonds who look like they're about
Mm,
to rob you, and then they look at you and they have the kindest face you've ever seen. I mean,
for
I
sure.
just didn't know these kind of figures existed. So
No,
I
yeah.
I love going to Patmos, and I'm endlessly edified by it. It also has a wonderful breeze, Patmos. In other words, because I'm not mad for excessive heat,
Mm,
but I can handle it if there's a breeze from the sea, and there's great breeze.
mm. Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that you didn't know that those kinds of figures existed in Christianity, and I think both of us, you know, growing up in the UK, you know, gosh, Reformation after this and after that, and the church is taking different forms, and the churches that I was taken to with my primary school on Easter was just this kind of very cold, very dull, hardly a stained glass window, hardly a cross, hardly anything. It was just cold, and there was no life in the place. It didn't feel edified or anything like that. And growing up through my teens, it was it felt like Christians at the time there were trying to make it cool and bring down Christianity and bring down the divine into the ordinary and into the awful, kind of guitar playing, cardigan wearing, Jesus loves you kind of stuff that just it was such a turn off to me, that by the age of 18 I just wanted to get out of the place and just I search for meaning elsewhere. And so whether that was going to India and going to the tree under the Buddha sat under and trying to see if there's something there, or the sleeping for a few nights in the Sikh temple, the Golden Temple, I think it's called, or going to the Ganges and all that kind of stuff, and not finding it there either, and just kind of being quite homeless spiritually for a long time, I think is a good way of putting it. And then for whatever reason, discovering orthodoxy, and it's just been it's been there's something very gosh, I don't even have the words for it, but it's something that's both brand new and contemporary and alive today, but it just feels ancient and mystical and all that kind of stuff. Not for the sake of triviality or aesthetics, but there's like a deep well there. There's something very deep there that that's intimidating almost if it wasn't so beautiful. That's what I'd probably describe orthodoxy as. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm aware of at the moment in England is actually it. I think orthodoxy is going to kind of take care of itself over the next few years. I think it's going to become a field hospital for people over here.
Yeah.
And churches are always hospitals. There's nothing new about that. But my heart actually goes out to Christians in Baptist, C of E. The charismatic and the evangelical thing is the fastest part, as far as I'm aware, in other parts of the world, by far the fastest growing.
Yeah.
But there's lots of small little parishes in England now who have not a clue what the Church of England means anymore,
Yeah.
have not a
Yeah.
clue about things they've held on to their whole lives, and are just seeing, talk about selling the farm, for
Mm.
shame.
Yeah.
So I hope to be part of conversations actually with people that are not just necessarily going to become Orthodox, but are
Yeah.
just good worker bee Christians that are looking for, well, what would a contemplative tradition look like in my life? How could I
Mm.
find some of the things that Martin is talking about and others are talking
Yeah.
about? So
Yeah.
another thing I feel passionately about actually is older men and women who have been stewed in this stuff, who've had their own dark nights of the soul, like John of the
Mm.
Cross, who've listened to the still small voice and have a lot to offer, but probably feel marginalized and rather lost in their little emptied parishes. Whilst,
Mm.
folks like myself on YouTube are lucky enough to get a reasonable sized audience. And so
Yeah.
I think that there will be a turn in this country. If Christianity is to survive at all, interestingly, it is the mystical departments, the contemplative departments that are stepping forward, ready to
Yeah.
announce themselves, and there's a terrific hunger for it.
Yeah. And look, if it has, if there's still any sort of Protestants or whatever listening at the moment, this I hope that I have some. I've had some great guests on this show who are definitely not Orthodox and come from a more sort of evangelical or Church of England approach, and their faith is massive and it's
Oh
just
yeah.
huge and it's remarkable and they've gone through amazing things and I learn from them and my enamoration, if is that a word, being enamored by orthodoxy is probably because I'm quite new to it, and so it's very much part of my just constant thought process. And so if it has come across strong, that's probably one of the reasons why. And that is the church and tradition I go to. But you're absolutely right, and it's going to be an interesting road ahead. I started this conversation by talking about the 90% drop in church attendance in the UK over the last century. But one of the conversations I did actually have with the Church of England pastor, I think he said that actually Bible sales have gone up. I think he said 87% or something amongst Gen Zers. Like it's the young people who are discovering it now on their own in a way. And that's going to be an interesting one to see.
It was. I know of I don't know them, but I heard recently of a very, very hip young man who's recently been baptized. And when his father asked him about it, he said, "Dad," he said, "atheism is for old people."
Yeah,
And
yeah, right, yeah,
I think we should be encouraged by that, because I think if church attendance dropped by 90%, there may be a reason for that, and the churches in themselves may be partially
yeah,
accountable for that, for robbing it of so much mystery and so much power. However, spiritual searching has not diminished. So, it's just gone into this myriad of different directions. But I think we have survived, the new atheism and all of that business, which I never was even really aware of at the time anyway. And I don't meet many people these days that are having arguments about the irrationality of Christianity or anything like that. What they are aware of is a tremendous yearning inside themselves for something of depth and for something that requires something from them rather than just an instant sedative. To go back to my original point, that is to do with the business of longing, not just the business of satisfied desire.
mm. I like that you kind of pinned a little bit of the blame there on the church. And to quote you again, if you don't mind, you did say something that I'm glad has come up. You said, "What kind of devilment got into the petri dish of Western consciousness that we managed to domesticate someone like Christ?" And I think, and I fear that that has what's happened, a kind of fierce domestication of Christ in the church, particularly. Again, I'll just talk from my own experience in England.
We
Mm.
are all on the road to Emmaus. We're
Mm.
all worried. We're all frightened, like those two fellas coming back from Jerusalem. And it's hard for me to talk about. It's such a moving story. And you remember it's dusk, and this stranger slips in beside them,
Mm,
and he walks with them, and he says, you know, why the long faces? And they say, are you the last person in the world that doesn't know, you know, this extraordinary healer has died, and etc. But there's rumors, the women, you see, it's the women that are saying
mm,
he's back. And he kind of scolds them, and he reminds them of everything way back that was prophesied about, you know, the Son of God, about the Messiah. And he mythologically reframes it all, which is what all of us, we all have to take turns being Jesus with our friends when we're tired. We all have to do that bit of shift work. It's hard, but that's what the Holy Spirit is. You want the Holy Spirit to be looking out of your eyes into every single situation that you're in. But then of course they sit with him, and there's this very haunting line that he's going somewhere else. We don't know where he's going, and they say, no, no, sit and eat with us. And it's as he's breaking the bread, they know, they suddenly know. And there's something for me so incredibly moving about, because liturgy is a very ordinary word. It really means repetition. It's the ordinary repetition of what he's doing with his hands, I think, that they go, oh, it's him, it's him, it's him. And he allows himself to be seen somehow at that moment. So we need an ordinariness to our religious practice, so we may behold Jesus over and over again. And we need to be Jesus to each other on the road to Emmaus, because we are also scared and frightened and filled with doubt.
goodness, Martin, that was you hit that one. You hit that one. I was actually going to ask you, well, I think you've just given me the answer, but I was just about to describe how I think any time you know, whenever I spend time on the biblical stories on scripture, that I find that it really is like this ocean where even just the smallest little moment, because the story of the road to Emmaus, it's a short thing, but there's just infinite depth there, and I find that often, particularly with Genesis, but even the Gospels and everything. And I was going to ask you whether there's a story right now that you're really chewing on that's revealing fresh wisdom that might be haunting you or that you're seeing play out. And I was really just curious to see or hear about what you're
Mm.
sinking your teeth into at the moment.
I think as we're having this conversation today, the thing that is coming up for me again and again is, here's another soundbite. We're being sold Pentecost, but we really have Babel. We're being sold Pentecost, but we really have Babel. So what do I mean by that? Of course, many people listening know that Pentecost is this moment of extraordinary communication. The Holy Spirit comes, we all understand each other in this plethora of different languages. Suddenly, everything is available in a way it's never been before. Well, that's what I get in the hallucination and the tyranny of technology now. Everything is available all the time. But of course, the reality is not at all like that. We are more isolated from each other than ever. As we build our own tower as a monument to our own magnificence, we become Babeled. And despite the technology that we have in our own hands, in actual fact, we are more lonely, we are more deprived, we have built more barriers and more blocks to our neighbours than ever before. So those two stories are working for me. We get sold Pentecost, but it's really Babel.
I don't want to end the interview. I want to keep going. I want to keep going.
Hmm.
And I know it's always good to leave people for more, wanting more. Maybe we can do this again. I'd love to bring you
Yeah,
back on the show.
cool.
Goodness.
I'll leave with one final little story that is again very meaningful for me, and it comes back to the notion of, if you feel completely out of touch with the notion of God as any kind of reality, just pay attention to your conscience for a while. Be led by your conscience.
Mm,
We remember it's coming towards the end of the teacher's life, and Jesus is coming down. Yeshua is coming down from the Mount of Olives to teach again. It's early in the morning. People are there, and they bring forward, do you remember the woman? And they say, this woman has committed adultery, and we know what the rules are. The woman should be stoned. What do you think? And they are gleeful you know, because they think they have God then, they think they have Christ then. Because if he says yes, she should be stoned, he loses the warmth and the compassion for crowd. But if he says no, then he's breaking tradition and law and all of that scandal that comes with that. And of course, we get this odd image that Christ is distracted almost at this moment, and he's drawing in the dust, which is often a rabbinical thing when you're thinking a rabbi may do that, traveling rabbi. But he says, well, of course, the answer's simple. Let he who be without sin cast the first stone. And in my words from earlier on, gradually everyone cops onto themselves and they disappear with the profundity of what's happened. And of course, then there's nobody left but you and Jesus, because you are that woman. That's you. That's you. And that's me.
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
says, look, love, get up and sin no more. But two things that we can forget. One is that there was somebody without sin there, and he could
Yeah.
have cast that first stone. Secondly, there is an old, it's a bit like Midrash really, there's an old early Christian idea that if you'd looked over the shoulder of Jesus and watched what he was drawing in the dust, it was an audit of your own sin, and everybody
Mm.
saw it. Every single person that looked over his shoulder into the dust saw their legacy writ large. Talking of great Anglicans, I was with the wonderful Rowan Williams, who's a tremendous guide and resource for me, great inspiration.
Yeah.
And I said, "What do you think happens when we die?" And he said, "I think the God of mercy will come to you and just lift up a mirror. So be ready for that. Be ready
Yeah.
for that. That's sobering. That you don't need the threat. You don't need the threat of all these medieval ideas of bubbling cauldrons and and never ending torment. Just that, just that.
Yeah.
Attend to the grace, lean to the good. Every day is an opportunity to start over.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you very much for that, especially in light of what we discussed today, and in terms of how we or our kids will look back at us and our work, and
Mm.
what temptations and what low hanging fruit did we take, and can we look at ourselves in the mirror knowing that we did the best thing that we could. It's been an absolute thrill and a pleasure, and I've gained so much from this conversation, and I know that other people will too. I really want to direct people to check you out everywhere they can, because what they'll find there is not clickbait. They're not going to find outrageous hot takes. What they're going to find is a deep well, which they can drink from in this tiresome world that we're living in at the moment. And so, feel free to link people. Where should they go? What website? What YouTube channel?
If you want to find out what I'm up to, go to drmartinshaw.com. It's that simple. That'll give you an enormous amount. On YouTube, we have a channel called Jawbone, which I love, and thank you for your kind words about that. If you
Yeah.
really want to know about what I'm up to on a weekly basis, subscribe to my Substack. Become a paid subscriber. It's the price of one English pint per month. It's not a lot. It's like
Mm.
£5. Where every week you get the sermon. You get whatever is alive and real to me that week. So Jawbone, Substack, West Country schoolofmyth.com. I'm sorry, no, martinshaw.com, Dr. Martin Shaw. That'll do you. That'll do you.
Yeah. I do appreciate the old picture of you and a pint of Guinness on Instagram though. So I
I
will
can't
tell
help
people to
it.
go on his.
I can't help it. It's not. I should be sponsored by them at this point, but I'm not. I'm not. It's becoming. I have a friend called Malcolm. Do you know Malcolm Geit?
Yes. Oh my God. I reached out to him recently and he couldn't do an interview, but my gosh, would I'd like to.
You and Malcolm will meet. Well, Malcolm, always has the pipe.
Yeah.
I mean, he really does have a Lord of the Rings thing going on. His
Yes. Yes.
new Arthurian translations are fantastic, or new
Yeah.
tellings are fantastic. But
Yeah.
yeah, and finally, the last thing I'd want to say is, come February, I have a book coming out. I'm very excited. It's called Liturgies of the Wild: Myths That Make Us, and it is absolutely the story of
Yeah.
my adventure into orthodoxy that began at the culmination of a 101-day vigil in a British
Yeah.
forest. And Really, the myth, the clue is in the subtitle. The myths that make us. These are the stories that you can lean back into. It's the ancestral kayak that's going to do you a lot of good. So come find out.
I already want the book. That is a whopper of a title. That's a very good book title. I can't wait to get my hands on it. And look, Martin, let's please not make this be the last conversation we have. I would love to invite you on, even if it's in a month or two, and there's something else that's on your mind, and we can dive into it. It's been an absolute pleasure. Can't wait to speak to you again. And until next time, Godspeed.
Especially.